March 3, 1943, 9:58 a.m. The Bismarck Sea. A 43-year-old man is flying a bomber 50 feet above the ocean surface. Not 8,000 feet. Not 5,000. 50. Low enough that the propellers are kicking white foam off the wave caps. Low enough that salt spray is streaking the windshield like rain. Ahead of him, a Japanese destroyer fills the glass. 2,000 tons of steel. Guns everywhere. Sailors scrambling on the deck, traversing their 25mm autocannons directly at his nose. He squeezes the trigger. 8 50-caliber machine guns erupt simultaneously. 120 rounds per second tear through the air. The nose of the bomber doesn't just fire, it screams. The cockpit floods with the smell of cordite. The rivets shriek. The aluminum frame shudders like a man taking a bullet, and the destroyer in front of him begins to come apart. Not slowly, not dramatically. It simply starts to disintegrate under a chainsaw made of lead. The engineers back in California had told him this was impossible. They had written memos. They had done the math. They had laughed. The wreckage now sinking into the Bismarck Sea wasn't laughing. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community exists for people who believe history's most important lessons were written not by generals in war rooms, but by men with grease on their hands and fire in their eyes. In the first year of the Pacific War, the United States Army Air Force had a problem. Actually, they had a catastrophe hiding behind a press release. The official narrative was clean and reassuring. American B-17 flying fortresses, the most advanced heavy bombers in the world, were dominating the skies. The Norden bomb sight, the most sophisticated targeting system ever built, could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. That was the phrase the generals used. Pickle barrel accuracy. It played beautifully in the newsreels. The reality was a disaster. In the Pacific, the targets weren't factories sitting still in a field. They weren't rail yards or fuel depots. The targets were ships. Japanese destroyers and troop transports moving at 30 knots, zigzagging across hundreds of miles of open ocean. When a B-17 released a bomb from 20,000 feet, that bomb took nearly 40 seconds to reach the water. In 40 seconds, a Japanese captain could turn his ship hard to port, light a cigarette, and watch the explosion erupt harmlessly half a mile away. The hit rate against moving ships from high altitude was less than 1%. The United States Army Air Force was burning millions of gallons of aviation fuel and killing fish. Meanwhile, the Japanese were running what the Allies had started calling the Tokyo Express. Fast convoys loaded with troops and supplies moving down the Solomon Sea corridor, reinforcing their garrisons at Lae and Salamaua on the northern coast of New Guinea. Every week, thousands more Japanese soldiers were landing on the island. They were building airstrips. They were constructing a fortress wall that pointed directly south toward Australia. If they landed enough men and secured those airfields, they could begin systematic bombing runs against Darwin, Brisbane, and beyond. The entire Allied position in the Southwest Pacific was sitting on a crumbling ledge, and the Japanese were chipping at it every single night. General George Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, looked at the reports on his desk in Brisbane and understood the truth that nobody in Washington wanted to say out loud. His heavy bombers were nearly useless against shipping. The doctrine was wrong. The technology was wrong. The entire strategic framework had been built for a European war against stationary industrial targets, and now he was fighting a naval war in a jungle theater against an enemy who moved fast and knew it. He needed something that could hit a ship, not from 20,000 feet, from point-blank range. He didn't have a dedicated attack aircraft. He had the B-25 Mitchell. The Mitchell was a solid plane, fast and rugged with a good range. But it had been designed for the wrong fight. The nose was a greenhouse of plexiglass panels housing a bombardier who sat on a small stool and peered through a delicately calibrated optical bomb sight. The plane carried a few defensive machine guns, mostly mounted to fire backward at pursuing fighters. It was built to deliver a payload and run. It was built to look away from danger, not charge toward it. Kenny needed a plane that charged. But nobody in his command seemed to know how to build one. Nobody except a man who had no business being in that conversation at all. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn. The men called him Pappy. At 43, he was ancient by Pacific aviation standards. Most of the pilots in Kenny's command were 21-year-old kids from Kansas and Ohio who had learned to fly 6 months earlier in peacetime training fields. Pappy had been flying since the 1920s. He had been a naval aviator. He had flown civilian cargo routes through the Philippine jungle for years, landing on dirt strips carved into mountainsides, fixing engines with whatever he could find in the nearest village. He knew these islands the way most men know their own backyards. But Pappy Gunn wasn't motivated by duty. He wasn't motivated by patriotism, or strategy, or any of the clean reasons men give in official documents. He was motivated by something much colder and much more dangerous. He was motivated by rage. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, Gunn had escaped in a damaged aircraft. He made it out. His wife Polly and their 4 children did not. They were captured in Manila and thrown into the Santo Tomas internment camp. Gunn knew what happened in those camps. He had heard the reports: starvation, disease, systematic brutality. Every day the war continued was another day his children might not survive. He didn't have time for doctrine. He didn't have patience for committees. He walked into General Kenny's office in Brisbane and proposed something that made the staff officers exchange glances across the room. He wanted to tear the glass nose off the B-25 Mitchell entirely. He wanted to rip out the bombardier's station, the bomb site, the whole defensive philosophy the aircraft had been built around. And in its place, he wanted to pack 4 fixed 50 caliber machine guns, plus 2 more in pods bolted to the fuselage sides, plus lock the top turret permanently forward. He wanted to turn a medium bomber into a flying battering ram with more forward firepower than a light tank. He wanted to fly it at wave height and put bombs into the sides of ships from 300 yards. Kenny was desperate enough to say yes. The engineers from North American Aviation, the company that had actually designed and built the B-25, were not. They sent memos. Long, carefully reasoned memos full of math. The nose of the B-25 was a lightweight structure. Aluminum strips holding plexiglass panels designed to support 1 man and a 15-pound instrument package. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was not a lightweight instrument. Each one weighed 64 pounds and fired a bullet the size of a man's finger at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The recoil energy from a single gun was enormous. Gunn wanted to fire 4 of them simultaneously from the same mounting point. The calculations were straightforward. The recoil force would shear the rivets from the aluminum frame. The nose section would snap off the fuselage. Even if it didn't, the vibration would shatter the plexiglass in milliseconds, blinding the pilot. And even if the glass somehow survived, the combined weight of 4 heavy guns, plus thousands of rounds of ammunition, would shift the aircraft's center of gravity so far forward that it would be uncontrollable. It would nosedive into the runway before it ever left the ground. They called it the suicide box. They told Kenny that Pappy Gunn was going to kill his pilots on the ground before the Japanese ever got a chance. Gunn read the memos. He threw them in the trash. He went to the scrap piles at the Royal Australian Air Force Base and started looking. Not for aviation-grade aluminum. For steel. He found old shock absorbers from junked vehicles. He found heavy industrial springs. He found felt pads used in heavy machinery. He carried them back to his hangar and started welding. His theory was simple, in the way that only truly original ideas are simple once you hear them explained. The engineers were assuming he would bolt the guns directly to the frame. Rigid mounting. Of course the frame would fail under that load. But Gunn wasn't going to bolt them. He was going to float them. He built what he called a spider mount. A framework of welded steel tubes that suspended all 4 guns together in a cradle that could slide backward on a track. Behind the cradle he installed his scavenged springs and shock absorbers. When the guns fired, the entire battery would recoil backward into the springs, which would absorb the energy before it ever reached the delicate aluminum skin of the aircraft. The guns would move. The plane would not. The young mechanics in the hangar watched the old man weld his contraption together and shook their heads. They called it Pappy's recoil toy. They whispered that he had finally cracked under the pressure. You couldn't fix structural physics with a collection of salvaged truck parts. You couldn't solve a center of gravity crisis with a welding torch and intuition. That was not how airplanes worked. The morning of the first test flight, the airfield in Brisbane went quiet in the way that air bases go quiet before something either historic or catastrophic. The North American aviation engineers had filed their final reports and washed their hands of the situation. The mechanics stood back with their arms crossed. The modified B-25 nose, heavy and ugly, sat at the end of the runway, looking like a machine that had been in a fight with a scrapyard and won. Gunn climbed in alone. No co-pilot, no crew. He was not going to put another man's life on a theory. He pushed the throttles forward. The Wright Cyclone engines roared. The plane felt sluggish, nose-heavy, dragging toward the ground like a truck loaded with wet cement. The end of the runway came up fast. The engineers watched, certain they were about to see a very expensive accident. At the last possible second, Gunn hauled back on the yoke. The nose groaned upward. The wheels cleared the dirt by inches. The suicide box was airborne. He climbed to 2,000 feet and flew toward the coast. Over the ocean, he leveled out, armed the system, and put his thumb over the solenoid switch. He had built this thing in a jungle hangar with scavenged parts. He had argued it into existence against every expert opinion available. Now he was about to find out if the math or the springs were right. He squeezed the trigger. The aircraft slowed down. The simultaneous recoil of 850 caliber guns firing together hit the airframe like a brake, physically bleeding knots off his airspeed. The cockpit noise was beyond deafening. The floor vibrated like a jackhammer platform. The smell of burning gunpowder filled the enclosed space instantly. But the nose stayed on. The glass didn't crack. The rivets held. Down on the water, the stream of tracers converged at 1,000 yards into a tight, concentrated cone. He wasn't spraying. He was drilling. Gunn landed the plane and taxied back to the hangar. The mechanics who had laughed at his recoil toy walked up slowly and looked at the soot-blackened nose. They checked the frame. No stress fractures, no popped rivets. The ugly contraption made of junkyard springs had done exactly what the old man promised it would do. But building the gun was only half of the equation. Guns can suppress a crew. They cannot sink a ship. For that, you need bombs. And dropping bombs from 50 feet above the water was an entirely different kind of impossible problem. Because in the next phase of Pappy Gunn's experiment, he wasn't just going to teach his pilots to fire at ships. He was going to teach them to skip bombs off the surface of the ocean and detonate them below the waterline. And the Japanese had no idea any of this was happening. A massive convoy was already assembling at Rabaul. 8 destroyers, 8 troop transports, 7,000 soldiers. The Tokyo Express was coming one final time, loaded and ready, and the Japanese commanders were counting on bad weather and high-altitude blindness to get them through. They were looking at the sky for the wrong kind of airplane. Pappy Gunn had done the impossible. He had taken a bomber that every engineer in California said would shake itself apart, packed 850 caliber machine guns into its nose, using junkyard springs and salvaged shock absorbers, and proved them all wrong over the waters off Brisbane. The suicide box flew. The recoil system held. The tracers converged at 1,000 yards into a cone of destruction tight enough to cut steel. One man, one hangar, one collection of scrap metal had just invalidated 2 years of official doctrine. But proving it worked in a test flight was one thing. Getting the United States Army Air Force to actually use it was something else entirely. Because standing between Pappy Gunn and the Japanese convoy routes was a wall far more resistant than any destroyer. It was made of brass insignia regulation manuals and the particular stubbornness of men who have spent 20 years being right. Brigadier General Howard Ramey had commanded bomber operations in the Southwest Pacific since the beginning of the campaign. He was not a stupid man. He was not a coward. He had built his career on precision, on doctrine, on the principle that military aviation operated within established parameters for very good reasons. Those reasons existed because men had died testing the boundaries. Ramey had read the North American aviation memos. He had read the stress calculations. He believed them. When Gunn walked into Ramey's office in January 1943 and laid out his modification program, the general listened with the expression of a man watching a mechanic try to explain why he had installed a racing engine in a school bus. "Major Gunn," Ramey said, folding his hands on the desk. "You are telling me you want to take multi-million-dollar aircraft strip out their factory-installed systems and replace them with welded scrap from a junkyard, based on your personal calculations." "Based on a test flight that proved it works, sir. One flight, one prototype, built without authorization and flown without clearance." Ramey leaned forward. "Do you understand what happens if I let every field commander start re-welding aircraft according to their own specifications? We stop having an air force. We have a collection of experiments that kill pilots." "With respect, sir, what we currently have is a collection of aircraft that can't hit the ships supplying 60,000 Japanese troops. The hit rate against moving vessels from high altitude is under 1%. My modification achieves nearly 50% hit rate at mast height. That is not an experiment. That is the solution." Ramey was silent for a moment. "You are 1 week away from a formal insubordination charge, Major. Stand down." Gunn walked out of the office. He did not stand down. The pressure from above was real. 2 of Gunn's converted aircraft had been flagged by an inspection team, and there was genuine talk of confiscating them and returning the noses to factory specification. The modification program operating out of Port Moresby existed in a bureaucratic gray zone that was narrowing by the day. Meanwhile, the intelligence reports coming in from coast watchers were becoming urgent. Japanese convoy traffic through the Bismarck Sea had increased significantly. The Tokyo Express wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. Then, General George Kenney made a phone call. Kenney had been watching the modification program since he authorized it months earlier, and he had seen the test results. More importantly, Kenney was a man who measured his career not in regulations followed, but in problems solved. He had no patience for doctrine that produced 1% hit rates. He called Ramey directly and told him to give Gunn 30 days and a proper demonstration. Not a single test plane over an empty ocean. A formal proving exercise with observers' instruments and a real target. If Gunn could demonstrate consistently superior results against a simulated ship target, the modification would receive official sanction. If he failed, the program ended, and Gunn would be reassigned to a supply depot in Queensland. 30 days. One chance. Everything on the table. The wreck of the SS Pruth sat on a reef off the coast of Port Moresby, like a battered old referee who had stopped caring about the game. It had been bombed before by training aircraft strafed and used as a navigation marker. Gunn turned it into a university. He brought 12 pilots out to that rusted hulk and flew with every single one of them personally. He sat in the co-pilot seat while they came in on their approach runs, and he shouted the same 3 words over and over until they heard them in their sleep. Lower. Get lower. The training was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with physical difficulty. Every instinct a trained pilot had developed over hundreds of hours in the air screamed against what Gunn was demanding. The ocean at 200 miles per hour from 50 feet is not a landscape. It is a blur. A gray-green wall rushing past so fast the peripheral vision cannot process it as something survivable. The pilots had to learn to ignore it entirely. They had to fixate on the target ahead and trust the altitude the way a racing driver trusts the track edge, not by watching it, but by feeling it. The skip bombing component added another layer of violence to the equation. A 500-pound bomb released at 50 feet and 200 miles per hour does not fall. It skips. It hits the water at a shallow angle, bounces once, twice, sometimes 3 times, and slams into the hull of a ship at the waterline before the delayed fuse detonates below the surface. The physics are elegant. The execution requires a pilot to fly directly at a warship until the ship fills the entire windscreen hold that line, while anti-aircraft guns are firing at his nose, and release the bomb at exactly 300 yards. Not 400, not 200. 300 plus or minus 20 yards, or the timing is wrong, and either the bomb sinks uselessly or the blast catches the aircraft on the way out. 12 pilots, 28 days, hundreds of practice runs against the wreck of the Pruth. The day of the formal demonstration, February 28, 1943. The airfield at Port Moresby was thick with men who had come to watch either a breakthrough or a disaster. Staff officers from Brisbane had flown up. 2 observers from the Inspector General's office stood near the runway with clipboards. Ramey was not present. He had sent a colonel in his place, which told Gunn everything he needed to know about how seriously the formal review was being taken. The weather that morning was poor. Low cloud ceiling visibility reduced a light chop on the water. Not ideal conditions for a demonstration designed to impress skeptics. Several of the observers checked their watches and made comments about rescheduling. Gunn taxied to the runway without waiting for a formal go-ahead. The first run came in at 48 feet and 195 miles per hour. The B-25 Strafer opened fire at 1,200 yards, walking the gun line across the deck of the Pruth from bow to stern. At 300 yards, the pilot released 2 500-pound practice bombs. Both skipped off the surface. One struck the hull plate exactly at the waterline. The observers watched through binoculars. The colonel with the clipboard lowered his binoculars and said nothing for a long moment. The second aircraft came in lower, 40 feet. The guns opened at 1,100 yards. The bomb release was precise. The skip was clean. Clean enough that the practice bomb lodged against the hull instead of bouncing past it. 6 aircraft ran the demonstration sequence. 4 achieved direct hull strikes. 1 achieved a near miss within 15 feet. 1 pilot came in too high and missed cleanly, which was documented in the report without comment. 4 out of 6 direct strikes. 67% effective hit rate against a stationary target under poor visibility conditions. Against high-altitude bombing doctrine, which considered 10% acceptable against a stationary target and struggled to achieve 1% against a moving ship, the numbers were not just better. They were from a different category of warfare entirely. The colonel filed his report that evening. General Kenny read it the following morning and immediately issued orders to convert every available B-25 in the theater. Not gradually. Not as a pilot program. Every available aircraft. Immediately. The war was not waiting for a committee review. The conversion crews worked around the clock in the mud at Port Moresby. They were not factory workers with clean tools and assembly specifications. They were mechanics operating in tropical heat, with mismatched parts, improvised mounts, and gun walking between the aircraft, pointing at welds and calling out corrections. The paint on the converted aircraft was never uniform. Some noses were bare metal. Some were primed gray. All of them were covered in soot within 48 hours of first use. They were ugly machines, and they did not care. By late February, Gunn had a strike force ready. 12 fully converted B-25 Strafers crews, trained pilots who had put in enough runs against the Pruth that the maneuver had become instinct rather than calculation. They walked to their aircraft differently than the pilots of 3 months earlier. Something had changed in the way they carried themselves. They had learned a new kind of flying, the kind that goes toward the thing that shoots back instead of away from it, and it had altered something fundamental in how they saw the mission. The Japanese High Command in Rabaul had no intelligence on any of this. Their reconnaissance over Port Moresby showed standard B-25 activity, standard training patterns. They had no reason to look more carefully. Why would they? The Americans had been flying high-altitude bombing missions for a year with negligible results. The Tokyo Express had been running almost unmolested. The convoy assembling at Rabaul 8 destroyers and 8 troop transports carrying the 51st Division had every reason to feel confident in the cover of bad weather and Japanese naval firepower. On March 1st, 1943, a lone patrol aircraft spotted the convoy through a break in the storm clouds moving west into the Bismarck Sea. The coordinates went back to Port Moresby within the hour. Kenny looked at the map. He looked at Gunn. He gave the order. But there was something the Japanese convoy commander had done that nobody in the Allied intelligence briefings had flagged yet. He had not come alone. Somewhere in the clouds above the Bismarck Sea, flying top cover for the convoy, were 70 Japanese Zero fighters. Fast maneuverable and flown by pilots who had been killing American aircraft since 1941. Gun strafers were flying at 50 feet. The Zeros were built to fight above 10,000. In theory, that mismatch favored the Americans. But 70 fighters against 12 modified bombers was not a theory. It was an arithmetic problem. And the answer was going to be written in fire on the surface of the Bismarck Sea. Part 3 begins the moment the first Japanese lookout sees something on the horizon that isn't where it's supposed to be. Not high in the sky, down on the water, moving at 200 miles per hour, coming straight for the convoy, and multiplying. Pappy Gunn had taken a bomber nobody believed and armed it with guns nobody approved. Trained pilots nobody had trained before and walked into the most skeptical room in the Southwest Pacific and proved every single doubter wrong. The formal demonstration on February 28th delivered a 67% hit rate against a stationary target. General Kenny signed the conversion orders that same evening. 12 Strafer B-25s were ready. The convoy was moving. The order was given. But 70 Japanese Zero fighters were flying top cover above those 8 destroyers and 8 transports. And nobody in the Allied planning room had fully gamed out what happened when the most lethal low-altitude attack aircraft ever improvised in a jungle hangar ran directly into the finest fighter screen in the Pacific. The answer came on March 3, 1943. And it rewrote the manual permanently. The Japanese convoy commander, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, had run convoys through Allied air coverage before and understood the geometry of survival. High-altitude bombers needed clear skies and stable formation flying. They needed time. They were predictable. His destroyers had been dodging their bombs for a year with minimal losses. His Zero fighter cover was positioned above 8,000 feet exactly where American heavy bombers operated. The weather corridor through the Bismarck Sea was tightening as the storm system broke apart, but Mikawa was confident. He had 8 warships, 70 fighters, and 7,000 soldiers who needed to reach Lai before the Allies could reinforce. What his lookouts reported at 10:02 a.m. on March 3rd did not match any threat profile in his operational files. Aircraft, very low. Moving at 200 miles per hour along the wave surface, not approaching from altitude. Coming in from the horizon like surface vessels, except they were faster than anything that floated. His anti-aircraft batteries traversed downward, searching for the correct elevation angle. The 5-inch main guns on his destroyers could not depress their barrels low enough to engage a target at 10 feet of altitude. The geometry that had protected his ships from high-altitude bombing had been completely inverted. The Zeros above 8,000 feet were in the wrong place to intercept aircraft flying below 50 feet. By the time they dove to engage, the B-25s were already among the ships. The convoy never recovered from those first 90 seconds. Australian Beaufighters arrived first, twin-engine heavy fighters with 4 cannons in the nose. They came in line abreast across the destroyer screen cannon fire, raking the exposed gun decks, forcing every anti-aircraft crew on every ship to take cover simultaneously. The suppression lasted less than 40 seconds. It was enough. The B-25 strafers came through the smoke. Major Ed Larner led the first element. His aircraft was the ugliest machine he had ever flown. Nose-heavy soot-stained, welded in 3 different countries, using parts from 2 different decades. It handled like a truck and hit like a freight train. He lined up on the destroyer Arashio at 1,200 yards and opened the nose guns. The tracers did not spray. They converged. A solid rope of armor-piercing incendiary rounds walked from the Arashio's bow to her bridge in 4 seconds. The gun crews on her deck did not have time to aim. They went down where they stood. Larner held the approach. 300 yards. He released 2 500-pound bombs and pulled back hard on the yoke. The bombs hit the water at a shallow angle 30 yards short of the hull. They skipped. One struck the Arashio at the waterline. The 5-second fuse ticked, while Larner's aircraft cleared the mast by less than 20 feet. The detonation lifted the destroyer's stern out of the water. Her boiler rooms flooded in under a minute. The Arashio broke her back and began to sink. The same scene was happening across the entire convoy simultaneously. The Japanese formation shattered. The troop transports designed to carry soldiers, not fight aircraft, were defenseless without the destroyer screen. Their hulls were thin steel over wooden internal framing. The 50 caliber rounds punched through them like paper. Fuel drums stored on deck ignited. Ammunition in the holds began cooking off. One transport, the Kyokusei Maru, was carrying aviation fuel. When the skip bomb detonated against her hull, she did not sink. She exploded. The fireball rose over 1,000 feet. The B-25 flying behind Larner flew through it. The paint on both wings blistered from the heat. The pilot came out the other side still flying. The Zeros finally came down from altitude. They found a battlefield that made no tactical sense. The B-25s were moving too fast and too low to engage cleanly without risking collision with the water or their own ships. 3 Zeros attempted diving attacks on the strafers during their bomb runs and pulled away without firing because the geometry was wrong. The B-25's rear gunners and side gunners engaged the fighters during egress. 3 Zeros were shot down, attempting pursuit at low altitude. The engagement lasted less than 30 minutes for the initial strike package. By noon, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. All 8 transport ships were hit. 7 were sinking or already gone. 4 destroyers were dead in the water burning or broken apart. The Arashio, the Tokitsukaze, the Shirayuki, the Arare. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the 51st Division were dead, most of them still aboard their ships when they went under. The water was covered in oil and debris across 12 miles of ocean surface. The Americans lost 13 men, 13 against 3,000. The hit rate that high-altitude doctrine had accepted at 1% against moving ships had been replaced by something the after-action reports struggled to quantify. The B-25 strafers achieved direct hull strikes on 11 of the 16 vessels they engaged. That was not a percentage improvement over existing doctrine. It was a different category of warfare. The Japanese response came within 48 hours. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo received the battle report and convened an emergency review. The message from the convoy's surviving officers was specific and alarming. The enemy has developed a new attack method, extremely low altitude, high speed, combined gun and bomb approach. Our anti-aircraft batteries cannot engage effectively. Our fighter cover cannot intercept in time. Recommend immediate suspension of all surface convoy operations in the Bismarck Sea corridor until countermeasures are developed. The Tokyo Express stopped running. Permanently. The Japanese Navy spent the following weeks attempting to reconstruct what had happened from survivor accounts and reconnaissance photographs of the wreckage. They identified the mast height approach. They identified the skip bombing signature, the holes punched in hull plating at or below the waterline. They began developing new convoy screening protocols that placed destroyers in closer formation and assigned fighters to lower altitude cover positions. These adjustments required significant reallocation of air assets that were already stretched thin across 3 active theaters. None of it solved the fundamental problem. You cannot effectively defend against an aircraft flying at 50 feet using weapons designed for targets at 10,000. The B-25 strafer had not found a gap in Japanese defenses. It had found the structural floor of the entire anti-aircraft defense architecture and gone underneath it. General Kenny's report to Washington, filed March 5, 1943, described the battle results with the measured language of official military communication. The underlying meaning was unmistakable. The doctrine built around high-altitude precision bombing against naval targets was obsolete. The replacement doctrine had been invented by a 43-year-old major in an unauthorized modification hangar using scavenged shock absorbers and a welding torch. The factory representatives from North American Aviation arrived in Port Moresby 2 weeks later with measuring tapes and clipboards. They climbed over the battle-worn strafers. They measured the steel plates. They sketched the spider mounts. They poked at the springs. Then they flew back to Kansas City and started designing the B-25J production model. Solid metal nose. 8 .50 caliber guns installed at the factory. Refined recoil suspension based directly on guns' field design. The engineers who had written the memos explaining why it was impossible now drew technical specifications for producing it by the thousands. They called it the Strafer model. The manual was rewritten. The suicide box became standard configuration for every B-25 delivered to the Pacific Theater for the remainder of the war. Gunn received no patent, no royalty, no official credit in the production documentation. He received a promotion and a handshake, and the satisfaction of watching factory-built copies of his impossible machine arrive by the shipload to finish the work he had started with a welding torch and a grudge. The broader impact moved faster than the production lines. Allied air groups across the Southwest Pacific began converting their B-25s using the Port Moresby modification pattern. By mid-1943, skip bombing had become standard tactical doctrine for all medium bomber operations against shipping. The training program Gunn had built around the wreck of the Pruth was formalized into an official curriculum taught to every replacement pilot arriving in theater. The hit rate against moving vessels never dropped below 40% again. Japanese resupply operations in New Guinea collapsed. Without the ability to run surface convoys safely, their garrisons at Lai and Salamaua began to starve. The fortress wall they had been building north of Australia started crumbling from the inside. The airstrips they had constructed with such effort became liabilities rather than assets as Allied air power, now fully equipped with purpose-built strafers, ranged freely across the convoy routes. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea is recorded in history as a decisive tactical victory. Strategically, it was something larger. It was the moment the Pacific War's momentum transferred and did not transfer back. The Japanese High Command understood they had lost the ability to reinforce New Guinea by sea. Without reinforcement, the island could not be held. Without the island, the southern advance was finished. The path to Australia was closed, not by a fleet action or a strategic bombing campaign. By a single improvised modification developed in a jungle workshop by a man who needed to sink ships fast enough to get his children out of a prison camp. Pappy Gunn had changed the course of the Pacific War. He had done it with springs from a junkyard, and the particular kind of focus that comes from having nothing left to lose except the 4 people who mattered most to him. But in Part 4, we follow the man himself into the final years of the war. Because after the Bismarck Sea, Pappy Gunn did not stop. He escalated. He took a 75mm field artillery cannon, a weapon designed to be towed by a truck and fired from the ground, and decided to install it in the nose of a B-25. The recoil of a 75mm cannon is like being hit by a freight train. When he test-fired it for the first time, the aircraft almost stopped in midair. He made it work anyway. And the story of what happened next, and what it finally cost him, is the chapter that most history books leave out entirely. From a jungle hangar in Brisbane, Pappy Gunn had built the impossible. Junkyard springs, salvaged shock absorbers, an unauthorized welding torch, and a collection of memos he threw in the trash. He turned a defensive bomber into the most lethal low-altitude attack aircraft in the Pacific, proved the engineers wrong at 67% hit rates, and then watched his creation sink 8 Japanese transports and 4 destroyers in a single morning. The Tokyo Express stopped running. New Guinea held. The southern advance toward Australia died in the oil slick spreading across the Bismarck Sea. But the history books record the battle. They rarely record what happened to the man who made it possible. And that story has a chapter that most people never reach. After the Bismarck Sea gun did not slow down, he escalated. The .50 caliber strafer had proven the concept. Now he wanted more range, more penetrating power, something that could reach inside a ship's engine room from 2 miles away and stop the vessel before it even got within range of his pilots. He pulled a 75mm M4 field artillery cannon, a weapon designed to be towed behind a truck, and fired from stationary ground positions, and decided to mount it in the nose of a B-25. The recoil of a 75mm cannon is not a mechanical problem. It is a physics crisis. When Gunn test-fired it for the first time in 1943, the aircraft decelerated so violently in midair that the instruments swung forward against their mounts. Rivets popped along the fuselage spine. The pilot described the sensation as flying into a wall. Gunn made it work. He designed a semi-automatic loading system so the pilot could fire from the cockpit without a loader. He refined the recoil damping until the airframe could absorb repeated shots without structural failure. He created a flying tank destroyer that could put a shell through the side of a transport vessel from distances far beyond the effective range of any shipboard anti-aircraft gun. The B-25G and H models, which incorporated the 75mm cannon directly from the factory, were built on the engineering foundation that Gunn had field-tested in a jungle hangar. He flew these aircraft personally. At 44 years old, with the war in its later stages, and the Philippines slowly coming back within reach, Gunn flew combat missions in aircraft that his own body had helped design. He was not supposed to be doing this. He was a modification expert, a technical officer, not a frontline pilot at his age. He did not care about the classification. His family was still in Santo Tomas. Every mile the Allied advance covered toward Manila was a mile closer to the only objective that had ever mattered to him. In late 1944, during a low-level mission over the Philippines, Gunn's luck finally ran out. His aircraft was hit. He brought it down into the jungle alive but badly burned by white phosphorus from an anti-aircraft round that had come through the fuselage. He lost a finger. His arm was mangled badly enough that the flight surgeons who treated him signed the paperwork to ground him permanently. They told him the war was over for him. He was 45 years old, burned crippled, and finished as a combat pilot. He talked his way back onto flight status. He flew supply runs. He flew reconnaissance. He flew anything with wings and an engine that someone would let him climb into. He stayed in the theater because Manila had not been liberated yet, and he was not leaving the Pacific until he knew. On February 3, 1945, the 1st Cavalry Division broke through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp. They found 3,700 civilians surviving on fewer than 700 calories per day. Skeletons in clothing. People who had learned to identify the sound of artillery by which direction it meant safety and which direction it meant more waiting. Among them, Polly Gunn and 4 children who had spent 3 years and 2 months in that camp. When Gunn walked through those gates, he was not the commerce destroyer. He was not the man who had changed Pacific Air doctrine. He was a husband and a father who had spent every waking hour of the previous 3 years building machines violent enough to reach the people he loved. He found them alive. That was the only number that had ever mattered. The rage that had powered everything, the cold focus that had let him throw away memos and ignore doctors and weld through tropical rainstorms, finally had nowhere left to go. It simply stopped. The war ended 6 months later. The Air Force offered him promotions, a desk at the Pentagon, a role training the next generation of aviators. Gunn turned them down. He had no interest in peacetime bureaucracy. He stayed in the Philippines. He started a civilian airline, Philippine Airlines, and went back to flying cargo and passengers over the jungle he had known since the 1920s, landing on dirt strips that terrified men half his age. He fixed engines with wire and instinct, and the particular confidence of someone who has already solved harder problems under worse conditions. But Pappy Gunn's real legacy was not a desk at a headquarters. It was flying over every battlefield the world would see for the next 80 years. The strafer concept he invented in that Brisbane hangar became the foundational doctrine for close air support and anti-shipping operations across every conflict that followed. In Korea, modified B-26 invaders used low-altitude strafing and skip bombing techniques directly descended from Gunn's Port Moresby training program. In Vietnam, the AC-47 gunship, which mounted side-firing weapons in a transport aircraft to create a continuous orbiting fire platform, was an institutional evolution of the same core idea: put the maximum possible firepower on a flexible airframe and take it to the target, instead of waiting for the target to hold still. The AC-130 Spectre gunship, which became the defining close air support platform of the late 20th century, carries a 105mm howitzer in its fuselage. That weapon traces its Pacific War lineage directly to the 75mm cannon gun bolted into the nose of a B-25, when the engineers told him it would stop the aircraft in mid-air. The A-10 Thunderbolt II. The most recognized close air support aircraft in modern military aviation is built around a 30mm rotary cannon that fires at 4,200 rounds per minute. The aircraft was designed from the outside inward, starting with the gun and building the airframe around it. That design philosophy, that a weapons platform should be optimized around its primary weapon, rather than the weapon being accommodated within an existing platform, is the direct intellectual descendant of what Gunn proved in 1943. He did not invent the A-10. He established the proof of concept that made every subsequent iteration of gun-centric attack aviation theoretically defensible. At least 12 nations currently operate aircraft whose design genealogy runs through the Strafer modification program. The deeper lesson of Pappy Gunn's story is not about machine guns or recoil springs. It is about the gap between what institutions can imagine and what individuals can see. The engineers at North American Aviation were not incompetent. They were correct within the boundaries of their expertise. The B-25 Mitchell airframe was not designed to carry 850 caliber machine guns in its nose. The math genuinely did not work for a rigid mounting system. Their memos were accurate. What they could not calculate was Gunn's specific insight that the problem was not the guns or the airframe, but the assumption of rigidity. Float the guns, let them move. Give the energy somewhere to go besides the rivets. That insight did not require a degree in aeronautical engineering. It required someone who had spent 20 years fixing engines in the field and understood intuitively that you do not fight force with force. You redirect it. History is full of these moments. The proximity fuse developed in secret by a team that included a watchmaker and a former automobile engineer detonated anti-aircraft shells within lethal range of aircraft without requiring direct contact and increased effective kill rates against aerial targets by over 700%. The Norden bomb sight, that the generals called pickle barrel accurate, was developed by a Dutch immigrant working in a private workshop in New York. The DUKW amphibious truck that moved supplies across the beaches of Normandy was designed by a yacht builder. The solutions that changed the Second World War consistently came from people who did not know what was supposed to be impossible. The institutions resisted every one of them. That resistance is not a malfunction. It is how large organizations protect themselves from the endless stream of bad ideas that outnumber good ones by 100 to 1. The tragedy is that the filtering mechanism cannot distinguish between them in advance. It filters by credential and precedent and official process, and those are exactly the criteria that a genuinely new idea fails by definition. Gunn's modification failed every institutional test and passed the only one that mattered. It worked. Now for the detail that most accounts of the Bismarck C leave out entirely. The original prototype B-25 Strafer The specific aircraft that Gunn modified in the Brisbane hangar using springs from a junkyard and steel tubing from an RAAF scrap pile was not sent to a museum after the battle. It kept flying combat missions through 1943 and into 1944. The aircraft was eventually lost not to enemy fire, but to an engine failure over the Coral Sea during a ferry flight in late 1944. The pilot survived, the plane did not. It went into 3,000 feet of water somewhere northeast of Queensland, carrying the original spider mount, the original scavenged springs, the original ugly welded steel cradle that the mechanics had called Pappy's recoil toy. The machine that proved the doctrine, the specific physical object that changed the course of Pacific air warfare, is sitting on the ocean floor. It has never been recovered. It will almost certainly never be recovered. There is no wreck marker. There is no GPS coordinate in any official record. There is a ferry flight log entry that says lost at sea and a pilot survival report and nothing else. The most important modification in Pacific War aviation history is somewhere in the Coral Sea, 3,000 feet down in the dark, with the springs still intact. Pappy Gunn died on January 16, 1957, when his Beechcraft Bonanza went down in a storm near Manila. He was 57 years old. He had survived the Japanese Navy 3 years of combat flying a plane crash in the jungle, white phosphorus burns, and the complete dismissal of every idea he ever had by people with more authority and less imagination. The weather got him in the end, which is almost fitting. The one variable you cannot modify, cannot reinforce with steel plates, cannot absorb with a spring system. From a civilian airline pilot grounded in a war zone with his family in a prison camp, Pappy Gunn built a weapon that sank 12 ships in a single morning, closed the Bismarck Sea to Japanese resupply operations, and saved the Allied position in New Guinea at a moment when the math was running out. He did it with a welding torch, a refusal to read memos, and a specific kind of focus that only comes from having a reason that does not fit in any official document. The engineers wrote the manual. Pappy Gunn rewrote the war. And somewhere at the bottom of the Coral Sea, the springs that made it possible are still holding their shape, still compressed, still waiting to release an energy that already changed everything.